Looking good, looking good. Da 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 da. All right. All right. Really? No sound detected? Is that lying to me? Okay, that just went away. I think it was just lying to me. All right. I'm going to continue on the Federalist Papers. All right. All right. All right, I think that's actually working now. All right, for some reason the sound is acting really weird. All right, but going on doing the next Federalist Papers. We've gotten through 30, still not even to the halfway point. All right, but so Federalist Papers. These are what Alexander Hamilton and a few other people too were writing to convince the people to ratify the Constitution. The Constitution has been written, and now he's like, all right, now we need to actually make this law. And he's going through, he's making the arguments, he's writing papers and dissertations and pamphlets. And last week we went through all of like his defenses of why we need a more centralized government in the federal system for defense, and now he's going on for taxation. Number 31. Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. Oh man, right off the bat, a word I don't know how to say.
Disquisition.
Disquisition. In disquisition of every kind, there are certain primary truths, or first principles, upon which all subsequent reasoning must depend. These contain an interval evidence which, attendant to all reflection or combination, commands the assent of the mind. Where it produces not this effect, it must proceed either from defect or disorder in the organs of perception, or from the influence of some strong interest or passion or prejudice. Of this nature are the maxims of geometry. That the whole is greater than its parts. Things equal to the same are equal to one another. Two straight lines cannot enclose a space, and that all right angles are equal to each other. Of the same nature of these maxims in ethical or politics, that there cannot be an effect without a cause, that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, that every power ought to consummate with its object, and there ought to be no limitation of power destined to the effect of purpose which is itself incapable of limitations. And there are other truths in the two latter sciences which, if they cannot pretend to rank in the class of axioms, are yet such direct inferences from them, and so obvious in themselves, and so agreeable to the natural and unsophisticated dictates of common sense, that they are a challenge to the assent and sound and unbiased mind, to a degree of force and conviction almost equally irresistible. All right, so he's talking his argument up. He's going to come make a great argument. He's going to wow us, right? The objects of geometrical inquiry are so entirely abstracted from those pursuits which stir up and put in motion the unruly passions of the human heart, that mankind without difficulty adopt not only more simple theorems of science, but even those abstruse paradoxes which, however they may appear susceptible of demonstration, are at a variance with the natural conceptions which the mind, without the aid of philosophy, would be led to entertain upon the subject. The infinite divisibility of matter, or in other words, the infinite divisibility of a finite thing, extending even onto the minute atom, is a point agreed among geometricians, not less fair, incomprehensible to the common sense than of any other mysteries in religion, against which the batteries of infidelity have so industriously leveled. Okay, so he's like saying, okay, even science, even politics has a science to it. But in the sciences of morals and politics, men are far less tractable. To a certain degree, it is the right and useful that this should be the case. Caution and investigation are necessary armor against error and imposition. But this untractableness may be carried too far and may degenerate into obscurity, pervasiveness, or disingenuity. Though it cannot be pretended that the principles of moral and political knowledge have, in general, the same degree of certainty with those of the mathematics, yet they have much better claims in this respect than to judge from the conduct of men particular situations. We should be disposed to allow them the obscurity. It is much oftener the passions of prejudice of the reasoner than in the subject. Men upon too many occasions do not give their own understandings fair play, but yield to some untoward bias. They entangle themselves in words and confound themselves in subtleties. How else can it happen if we admit the objectors to be sincere in their oppositions, that positions so clear as those which manifest the necessity of general power of taxation in the government of the Union should have to encounter any adversaries among men of discernment, though these positions have... Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Test. Mic's still working? All right. A government ought to contain itself every power requisite to the full accomplishment of the objects committed to its care, and to the complete execution of the trust for which it is responsible, free from every other control but a regard to the public good and to the sense of the people. As the duties of the superintending the national defense and the securing of public peace against foreign or domestic violence involve a provision for casualties and danger to which no possible limits can be assigned, the power of making that provision ought to know other bounds than the exigencies of the nation and the resources of the community. as revenue is essential engine by which the means answering to the national exigencies must be procured. The power of producing that article is the full extent and necessity to be comprehended in the providing of the exigencies. Okay, so he's really trying to make the case for the importance of taxes, because he's making a really hard case here that we need taxes, which is a hard case to make in any circumstance. But now, let's see how it goes. As theory and practice conspire to prove the power of producing revenue is unveiling when the exercise over the states and their collective capacities, the federal government must of necessity be invested with the unqualified power of taxation in the ordinary modes. Do not experience evidence to the contrary. It would be natural to conclude that the property of the general power of taxation in the national government might safely be permitted to rest on the evidence of those propositions, unassisted by the additional arguments or illustrations. But we find, in fact, that the antagonists of the prose constitution so far have acquiescing in their justness or truth, seem to make their principal and most zealous effort against this part of the plan. It may therefore be satisfactory to analyze the arguments which would they combat it. All right, so the fighters of the Constitution, their main argument against it seems to be over the issues of taxation. So he's going to have to make a hard case here. This is like, so he's setting up like, hey, this is the part that they hate the most. So he's kind of setting himself up here, like, oh, it's going to be difficult, because this is their main source of contention. Those of them which have been most labored with the view seems in substance to the amount to this. It is not true, because the exigencies of the Union may not be susceptible of limitation, and that its power of laying taxes ought to be unconfined. Revenue is a requisite to the purposes of local administration as those of the Union, and the former are at least of equal importance with the latter to the happiness of the people. It is therefore as necessary that the state government should be able to command the means of supplying their wants, as the national government should possess the like facility in respect to the wants of the Union. But an infinite power of taxation in the latter might, and probably would in time, deprive the former of the means of providing for their own necessities, and would subject them entirely to the mercy of the national legislator. As the laws of the Union are to become supreme law of the land, and that it is to have the power to pass all laws that may be necessary, all caps, for the carrying into the execution of the authorities which it has proposed to vest it, the national government might at time abolish the taxes imposed for state objects upon the pretense of interference with its own. It might allege a necessity of doing this in order to give efficacy to the national revenues, and thus all resources of taxation might by degrees become the subject of federal monopoly, to the entire exclusion and destruction of the state governments. Okay, so he's setting up the other argument that these giving the federal government infinite ability to tax, then the state government, you have the possibility that this could overwrite all the state government's ability to collect taxation and have any importance, because he's already made the argument that you need taxes to do things. So, all right, let's see. So set up the opposing argument. This mode of reasoning appears to sometimes to turn upon the supposition of usurpation in the national government. At other times, it seems to be designed only as a deduction from the constitutional operations of its intended powers. It is only in the latter light that it can be admitted to have the pretensions of fairness. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpations of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss, and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. Imagination may range at pleasure till it gets bewildered amidst the labyrinths of an enchanted castle, and knows not on which side to turn to extradite itself from the perplexities into which it has rarely adventured. Whether it may be the limits or modifications of the power of union, it is easy to imagine an endless train of possible dangers. And by indulging an excess of jealousy and timidity, we may bring ourselves to a state of absolute skepticism and irresolution. I repeat here what I have observed in substance in another place, that all observations founded upon the dangers of usurpation ought to be referred to the composition and structure of government, not to the nature or extent of its powers. All right, so he's saying you're going to have a hard time limiting a government's power, but you can set up the guardrails and the rules and the structure of government to prevent these usurpations, these taking overs. The state governments, by their original constitutions, are invested with the complete sovereignty in what does our security consist against usurpation from that quarter, doubtless in the manner of formation, and in a due dependence of those who to administer them upon the people. If the proposed construction of the federal government be found, upon an impartial examination of it, to be such as to afford, to proper extent, the same species of security, all apprehensions on the score of usurpation ought to be discarded. It should not be forgotten that the disposition of the state governments is to encroach upon the rights of the Union is quite as probable as a disposition in the Union to encroach upon the rights of state governments. All right, so he's saying we have this countering balance here. The state governments have a tend to try to usurp the power of the federal government, and the federal government is going to have a counterbalancing power to try to of usurping the powers of the state governments. What side would likely to prevail in such a conflict must depend on the means which the contending parties could employ towards ensuring success, as in republic strength is to always on the side of the people, and there are weighty reasons to induce a belief that the state governments will commonly possess the most influence over them. The natural conclusion is that such contest will be most apt to end in disadvantage of the Union. And there's a greater probability of encroachments by the members upon the federal head than the federal head upon the members. It is evident that all conjectures of this kind must be extremely vague and fallible, and that it is by far the safest course to lay them altogether aside, and to confine our attention wholly to the nature and extent of the powers as they are delineated in the Constitution. Everything beyond this must be left to prudence and firmness of the people, who, as they hold the scales in their own hands, it is to be hoped will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and the state governments. Upon this ground, which is evidently the true one, it will not be difficult to obviate the objections which have been made to an indefinite power of taxation in the United States. All right, that's number 31. I think all of these today, all the ones all the way through 36, are still over the same taxation arguments. All right, yeah, same subject continued concerning the general power of taxation. All right, as he likes to do, Hamilton likes to go all caps at the beginning of these. Although I am of the opinion that there would be no real danger of the consequences which seem to apprehend to the state governments, from a power in union to control them in the levies of money, because I am persuaded that the sense of the people, the extreme hazard of provoking the resentment of the state governments, and a convention of utility and necessity of local administrations for local purposes, would be a complete barrier against the oppressive use of such a power. Yet I'm willing here to allow, in its full extent, the justice of the reasoning which require the individual states should possess an independent and uncontrollable authority to raise their own revenues for the supply of their own wants. And making this concession, I affirm that with the sole exception of duties on imports and exports, they would, under the plan of the convention, retain that authority in the most absolute and unqualified sense, and any attempt to take part on the national government to abridge them in the exercise it would be the violent assumption of power unwarranted by the Articles of Clause in the Constitution. And this is the case. The states have the right to tax their citizens as seen fit. The states can make their own taxes. The only rule in the Constitution is that the states cannot imply their own duties or tariffs. The entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. But as the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation, the state governments would clearly retain all the rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which they were not by the fact exclusively delegated to the United States. This exclusive delegation, or rather this alienation of state sovereignty, would only exist in 3 cases: where the Constitution in express terms granted an exclusive authority to the Union, where it granted one instance an authority to the Union and another prohibited the states from exercising the like authority, and where it granted an authority to the Union to which a similar authority in the states would be absolutely and totally contradictory and repugnant. I use these terms to distinguish this last case from another which might appear to resemble it. But which would in fact be essentially different, I mean where the exercise of the concurrent jurisdiction might be productive of occasional inferences in the policy of any branch of the administration, but would not imply any direct contradiction or repugnancy in a point of constitutional authority. These 3 cases of exclusive jurisdiction in the federal government may be exemplified by the following instances. The last cause, but 1/8 in the 8th section of the first article, provides expressly that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation over the district to be apportioned to the seat of government. The answers to the first case, the first clause of the same section empowers Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And the second clause of the 10th section of the same article declares that no state shall, quotation, without the consent of Congress, lay any impost or duties or on impost or exports, except for the purposes of executing its inspection laws. Hence would result an exclusive power of the Union to lay duties on imposts and exports, with the particular exception mentioned. But this power is abridged by another clause, which declares that no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state, in consequence of which qualification it is now extends to the duties on imports. This answers to the second case. The third will be found in the clause which declares Congress shall have power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization through the United States. This must necessarily be exclusive, because if each state had the power to prescribe a distinct rule, there could be not a uniform rule, which is kind of self-evident. If each state had its own rules on who could become a citizen, that could get real confusing real fast. Imagine if Texas had different rules, what rules Texas would have for how you became a citizen versus how, California, that would be the most extreme examples. A case which may perhaps be thought to resemble the latter, but which in fact is widely different, affects the question immediately under consideration. I mean the power of imposing taxes on all articles other than exports and imports. This, I contend, is manifestly a concurrent and co-equal authority in the United States and the individual states. There is plainly no expression in the granting clause which makes the power exclusive in the Union. There is no independent clause or sentence which prohibits the states from exercising it. So far, this is from being the case that the plain and conclusive argument to the contrary is deduced from the restraint laid upon the states in relation to the duties on imports and exports. This restriction implies an admission that if we were not inserted, the states would possess the power it excludes, and it implies a further admission that as to all other taxes, the authority of the states remains undiminished. In any other view, it would be both unnecessary and dangerous. It would be unnecessary because if you grant the union of the power of laying such duties implied the exclusion of the states, or even their subordination in this particular, there could be no need for such a restriction. It would be dangerous. Oh, why is it yelling at me? Because the Oh, no, you're kidding me. I just lost my spot. It would be dangerous because the introduction of its leads directly to the conclusion which had been mentioned, and which, if the reasoning and objects be just, could not have been intended. I mean that the states, in all cases to which the restriction did not apply, would have a concurrent power of taxation within the Union. The restriction in question amounts to what the lawyers call negative pregnant. I've never heard that term before. That is a negation of one thing and the affirmance of another, a negation of the authority of the states to impose taxes on imports and exports, and the affirmance of the authority to impose them on all other articles. It would be mere sophistry to argue that it is meant to exclude them absolutely from the imposition of taxes of the former kind, and to leave them at liberty to lay others subject to the control of the national legislator. The restraining or prohibitory clause only says that they shall not, without the consent of Congress, lay such duties, and if we are to understand this in the sense that's mentioned, the Constitution then would be made to introduce a former provision for the sake of a very absurd conclusion, which is that the states, with the consent of the national legislature, might tax imports and exports, and they might tax every other article unless controlled by the same body. If this was the intention, why not leave it in the first instance to what is alleged of the natural operation of the original clause, conferring the general power of taxation upon the Union? It is evident that this could not have been the intention, and that it would not bear the construction of the kind. All right, so this is really wordy and really complicated for kind of a simple clause. He's like, we wrote it how we wrote it. We didn't try to trick you. The states can't We wrote that the states can't do tariffs. The individual states can't do tariffs. This we weren't saying, because he's talking to the people that are arguing against the Constitution, and this is what they're saying, is like, we didn't say they can't do any other kind of taxes, and just because we said they can't do this one tax doesn't mean that we're going to come in and tell them they can't do another kind of tax. As to the supposition and repugnancy between the power of taxation in the states and the Union, it cannot be supported in the sense which would be requisite to work an exclusion of the states. It is indeed possible that a tax might be laid on a particular article by a state which might render it inexpedient that thus a further tax should be laid on the same article by the Union, but it would not imply a constitutional inability to impose a further tax. The quantity of the imposition, the expediency, and inexpediency of an increase on the other side would be mutual questions of prudence, but there would be involved no direct contradiction of power. The particular policy of the national and that of the state systems of finance must now and not exactly coincide and might require reciprocal forbearances. It is not, however, a mere possibility of inconvenience in the exercises of power, but an immediate constitutional repugnancy that can by implication alienate and extinguish a pre-existing right of sovereignty. The necessity of a current jurisdiction in cases resulting from the division of the sovereign of power, and the rule that all authorities of which the states are not explicitly divested in favor of the Union remain with them in full vigor. It is not a theoretical consequence of that division, but is clearly admitted by the whole tenure of the instrument which contains the article of the proposed Constitution. We there find it, notwithstanding the affirmation grants of the general authorities. So he's basically saying, if the Constitution doesn't say otherwise, the states retain that power. If it doesn't say that it gives it to them, or it says it doesn't take it away, or if it doesn't say that the federal government gets that power, it remains with the states. There have been the most pointed care in those cases which deemed improper that the like authorities should reside in the states, to insert negative clauses prohibiting the exercise of them by the states. The 10th section of the first article consists altogether of such provisions. This circumstance is clear indication of the sense of the convention. It furnishes a rule of interpretation out of the body of the act, which justifies the position I have advanced and refutes every hypothesis to the contrary. Publius. All right. I know this can get pretty dry. But let's keep going. Number 33. The residue of the argument against the provisions of the Constitution in respect to taxation is... did I just scroll? Is ingrafted upon the following clause. The last clause of the 8th section of the first article of the plan under the consideration authorizes the national legislature to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out the execution of the powers by the Constitution vested in the government of the United States, or in the department or any officer thereof. And the second clause of the 6th article declares that the Constitution and the laws of the United States, made in the prudence therefore of the treaties made by their authority, shall be the supreme law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. These two clauses have been the source of much virulent and invective and petulant declamation. I'm really tired of this scrolling up on me. These two clauses have been the source of much virulent and invective and petulant declamation against the proposed Constitution. They have been held up to the people in all the exaggerated colors of misrepresentation as the pernicious engines by which their local governments were to be destroyed and by their liberties exterminated, as the hideous monster whose devouring jaws would spare neither... okay, I gotta be careful with the stupid filter. With neither gender nor age, nor high nor low, nor sacred nor profane, and yet, strange as it may appear, after all this clamor, to those who may not have happened to contemplate them in the same light, it may be affirmed with the confidence that the constitutional operation of the intended government... What is going on with my mouse? It is driving me absolutely crazy. Petulant declamation against the proposed Constitution. They have been held up to the people and exaggerated. All right, we just read this. What is a power but without the ability or facility of doing a thing? What is the ability to do a thing but the power of employing the means of necessity of execution? What is the legislative power but a power of making laws? What are the means to execute a legislative power but laws? What is the power of laying and collecting taxes but a legislative power or a power of making laws to lay and collect taxes? What are the proportionments of executing such a power but necessary and proper laws? The simple train of inquiry furnishes us at once with a test by which to judge the true nature of the clause complained of. It conducts us to a palpable truth, that a power to lay and collect taxes must be a power to pass all laws necessary and proper for the execution of that power. And what does the unfortunate and cumulated provision in question do more than declare the same truth, to wit, that the national legislator, to whom the power of laying collected taxes has been previously given, might in the execution of that power pass all laws necessary and proper to carry it into effect. I have applied these observations, thus particularly to the power of taxation, because it is the immediate subject under consideration, and because it is the most important of the authorities proposed to be conferred upon the Union. All right, so he's talking about taxes because it's the one everyone's talking about. But the same process will lead us to the same result. In retaliation to all other powers declared in this Constitution, and it is expressly to execute these powers that the sweeping clause, as has been affectionately called, authorities and national legislators to pass all necessary and proper laws. If there is anything exceptional, it must be sought for the specific powers over which the general declaration is predicated. The declaration itself, though it may be chargeable with tautology or redundancy, it is at least perfectly harmless. And this is where we get the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause. This is what he's making the arguments for. But suspicion may ask, why then is it introduced? The answer is that it could only have been done for a greater caution, and to guard against all caviling refinements in those who might hitherto feel a disposition to curtail and evade the legitimate authorities of the Union. The convention probably foresaw what it has been a principal aim of the papers to inculcate, that the danger which most threatens our political welfare is the state governments, will finally sap the foundations of the Union, and might therefore think it necessary. It is so cardinal a point to leave nothing to the construction. Whatever may have been the inducement to it, the wisdom of precaution is evident from the cry which has been raised against it, as the very cry betrays the disposition to question the great and essential truth, which is manifestly the object of the provision to declare. But it may be asked again, who is to judge of the necessity and propriety of the laws to be passed for the executing the powers of the Union? I answer, first, that this question arises as well as to simply grant those powers as to the declaratory clause, and I answer, in the second place, that the national government, like every other, must judge in the first instances of the proper exercise of its powers, and its constituents in the last. If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority to make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people, whose creature it is, must appeal to the standards they have formed, and take such measures to readdress the injury done to the Constitution as the exigency must suggest and the prudence justify. The property of a law in its constitutional light must always be determined by the nature of the powers upon which it is founded. Suppose some forced constructions of its authority, which indeed cannot easily be imagined, the federal legislature should attempt to vary the law of descent in any state. Would it not be evident that, making such an attempt, it has exceeded its jurisdiction and infringed upon that of the states? Suppose again that upon the pretense of an interference with its revenues, it should undertake the abrogate of a land tax imposed by the authority of the state. Would it not be equally evident that this was an invasion of that concurrent jurisdiction in respect to this species of tax, which its constitution plainly supposes to exist in the state governments? If there's ever should be in doubt on this head, the credit of it will entirely due to those reasoners who, in the imprudent zeal of their animosity to the plan of the convention, have labored to envelop a cloud calculated to obscure the plainest and simplest truths. But it is said that the laws of the Union are to be the supreme law of the land. By what inference can be drawn from this? From what would it amount to? If they were not to be supreme, it is evident that they would amount to nothing. A law, by a very meaning of terms, includes supremacy. It is a rule which those whom it is prescribed are bound to observe. This results from every political association. If individuals enter into a state of society, the laws of that society must be the supreme regulator of their conduct. If a number of political societies enter a larger political society, the laws which the latter may enact, pursuant to the powers instructed to it by the Constitution, must necessarily be the supreme over those societies and the individuals of whom they are composed. It would otherwise be a mere treaty, dependent on the good faith of the parties, and not a government, which is only another word for political power and supremacy. But it will not follow from the doctrine that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residual authorities of smaller societies. It will become the supreme law of the land. These will be merely acts of usurpation, and will deserve to be treated as such. Hence, we perceive that the clause which declares the supremacy of the laws of the Union, like the one we have just before consideration, only declares a truth which flows immediately and necessarily from the institution of the federal government. It will not, I presume, have escaped observation that as it expressly confines this supremacy to the laws pursuant to the Constitution, which I mention merely as an instance of caution in the convention, since that limitation would have been understood, though it have not been expressed. Through a law, therefore, laying a tax for the use of the United States should be supreme in its nature, and it could not legally be opposed or controlled. Yet a law for abridging or preventing the collection of a tax laid by the authority of the state, unless upon the imports and exports, would not be the supreme law of the land, but a usurpation of power not granted by the Constitution. As far as an improper accumulation of taxes on the same object might tend to render the collection difficult or precarious, this would be a mutual inconvenience, not arising from the supremacy or defect of power on either side, but from an injudicious exercise of power by one or the other, in a manner of equally disadvantageous to both. It is to be hoped and presumed, however, that the mutual interests would dictate a concert in this respect, which would avoid any material inconvenience. The inference from the whole is that the individual states, under the proposed Constitution, retain an independent and uncontrollable authority to raise revenue to any extent which they may stand to need, by every kind of taxation except duties on imports and exports. It will be shown that in the next paper that the concurrent jurisdiction in the article of taxation was the only admissible substitute for an entire subordination. In respect this branch of power, the state authority to the Union. Publius. All right, so he's making an argument for the supremacy clause. Oh. Let's see where he goes from here. All right. How long have we been going? 42 minutes? All right, we're good. Number 34, the same subject continued, considering the general power of taxation. I flatter myself it has been clearly shown in my last number of particular states under the prose Constitution would have co-equal authority with the Union in the article of revenue, except as to the duties on imports. And this leaves open to the states far greater part of the resources of the community. There can be no color from the assertion that they would not propose the means as abundant as it could be desired for the supply of their own wants, independent from all external control, that the field is sufficiently wide and it will be fully appear when it comes to avert the considerable share of the public expenses for which it will fall to the lot of the state governments to provide. To argue upon the abstract principles that this coordinate authority cannot exist is to set up supposition to the theory against the fact of reality. However proper such reasoning might be able to show a thing ought not to exist. They are wholly to be rejected when they are made use to prove that it does not exist contrary to the evidence of the fact itself. It is well known that in the Roman Republic that the legislative authority in the last resort resides for ages in two different political bodies, not as branches of the same legislator, but as a distinct and independent legislators, in each of which an opposite interest prevailed. In one, the patrician, in the other, the plebeian. Many arguments have been made abdicated to prove the unfitness of the two such seemingly contradictory authorities, each having a power of annul or repeal the acts of the other. But a man would have been regarded as frantic who should have attempted at Rome to disprove their existence. It will be readily understood that I allude to the Comita Centaurea. Comita Centaurea was a powerful popular assembly in the Roman Republic responsible for electing high-ranking officials based on wealth and military status, with wealthier sayers receiving more of a vote. And the Comtria Tribula, tributary. This is, I think, the common house. Was a ancient Roman. The citizens and laws, the low-ranking officials, quaesitors, and all right. So it's kind of like the House and the Senate kind of thing. The former in the commons, the former in which the people voted by centuries, was so arranged as to give a superiority to the patrician interest. In the latter, the numbers prevailed. The plebeian interest had the entire predominancy, and yet these two legislators coexisted for ages. The Roman Republic attained the utmost height of human greatness. In the case of particular under consideration, there is no such contradiction as is to appear the example cited. There is no power on either side to annul the acts of the other, and in practice there is little reason to apprehend any inconvenience, because in short course of time the wants of the states will naturally reduce themselves to a very narrow compass, and in the interim the United States will in all probability find it convenient to abstain wholly from these objects to which the particular states would be inclined to resort. The former and more precise judgment of the true merits of this question, it will be well to advert the proportion between the objects that will require a federal provision in respect to revenue, and those of which will require a state provision. We shall discover that the former are altogether unlimited, and that the latter are circumscribed within the very moderate bounds. In pursuing this inquiry, we must bear in mind that we are not to confine our view into the present period, but to look forward to a more remote futurity. Constructions of civil government are not to be framed upon the calculation of existing I can never say this word. So much trouble.
Exigency.
Exits circumstances, but upon the combination of these with the probable, he used it twice, circumstances of the ages according to the natural and course of human affairs. Nothing, therefore, can be more fallacious than to infer the extent of any power proper to be lodged in the national government from an estimate of its immediate necessities. There ought to be a capacity to provide for the future contingencies as they may happen, and as these illimitable in their nature, it is impossible safely to limit their capacity. It is true, perhaps, that a computation might be made with sufficient accuracy to answer the purpose and quality of revenue requisite to discharge the subsisting engagements of the Union, and to maintain those establishments which for some time to come will suffice in a time of peace. But would it be wise, or would it not rather be extreme of folly, to stop at this point and to leave the government entrusted with the care of the national defense in a state of absolute incapacity to provide for the protection of the community against future invasions of the public peace by foreign war or domestic convulsions? If, on the contrary, we ought to exceed this point, where can we stop, short of indefinite power of providing for emergencies as they arise? Though it is easy to assert in general terms the possibility of forming rational judgment of a due provision against the probable dangers, yet we may safely challenge those who have the assertion to bring forward their data, and may affirm that they would be found as vague and uncertain as they could to produce the established and probable duration of the world. Observation confined to those mere prospects of internal attacks can deserve no weight, though these will admit no satisfactory calculations. But if we mean to be a commercial people, it must form a part of our policy to be able to defend that commerce, to support of a navy in naval wars, and to involve contingencies that must baffle the efforts of political arithmetic. Admitting that we ought to try the novel and absurd experiments in the politics of trying up the hands of government from the offensive founded upon the reasons of state, yet certainly we ought not to be. Sorry. Relax. It's okay. From guarding the community against ambition or enmity of other nations, a cloud has been for some time hanging over the European world. If it should break forth into a storm, who can assure us that its progress, a part of fury, would not be spent upon us? No reasonable man would be hastily to pronounce that we are entirely out of its reach, or on the combustible materials that it now seems to be collecting, should we be dissipated without the coming maturity, or of a flame should be kindled without extending to us. What security can we have that our tranquillity will long remain undisturbed from the source of another cause, from some other quarter? Let us recollect that peace or war, we will not always be left to our option, that however moderate or unambitious we may be, we cannot count upon that moderation, or hopes to extinguish the ambition of others who could have imagined at the conclusion of the last war that France and Britain, wearied and exhausted as they both were, would soon have looked with such a hostile aspect upon each other. To judge from the history of mankind, we shall be compelled to conclude that the fiery and destructive passions of war reign in the human breast with much more powerful sway than the mild and benefit sentiments of peace, and that no model of our political system upon speculations of lasting tranquility is to calculate upon the weaker springs of the human character. What is the chief? Okay, so we can't just give, this is the only taxes the government can do. We can't do that. It's like, basically it's like, hey, we can't just have this one tax. We can't limit the government to having no new taxes, because then, what about war, bro? What are the chief sources of expense in every government? What has occasioned the numerous accumulation of debts to which several of the European nations are oppressed? The answer is plainly wars and rebellions. The support of those institutions which are necessary to guard the body politique against these two most mortal diseases of society. The expenditures arising from those institutions are relative to the mere domestic police of the state, to support the legislative, executive, and judicial departments, which with the different appendages, and to the encouragement of agriculture and manufactories, which will comprehend the most of all objects of the state expenditure, are insufficient in comparison to those who relate to the national defense. In the kingdom of Great Britain, where all the ostentatious apparatus of monarchy is to be provided for, not above a 15th part of the annual income of the national is appropriated to a class of expenses last mentioned. The other 14/15 are absorbed in the payment of the interest of debts contracted for the carrying on of wars in which that country has been engaged, and in the maintenance of fleets and armies. If on the one hand it should be observed that the expenses are incurred are on the prosecution of the ambitious enterprises and vainglorious pursuits of a monarchy are not a proper standard which to judge those who might be necessarily in a republic, it ought on the other hand to remark that they should be as a great a disposition between the profusion and extravagance of a wealthy kingdom in its domestic administration and the frugalness and the economy which the particular became the modest simplicity of a republican government. If we balance a proper deduction from one side against that which is supposed to ought to be made from the other, the proportion may still be considered as holding good. But let us avert to the large debt, which we have ourselves contracted in a single war, and let us calculate on a common share of the events which disturb the peace of nations, and we shall instantly perceive, without the aid of any elaborate illustrations, that there must always be an immense disproportion between the objects of federal and state expenditures. It is true that the several states separately are encumbered with considerable debts, which are at the extremities of the late war, but this cannot happen again if the proposed systems to be adopted, and when these debts are discharged, the only call for revenue of any consequence which the state governments will continue to experience will be for the mere support of the respective civil lists, to which we will add all contingencies. The total amount of every state ought to fall considerably short of £200,000. I wonder what that is in today's money. Okay. 200. In 1787. That'd be about $5 billion. In framing a government for prosperity as well as ourselves, we ought, in those provisions which we have designed to be permanent, to calculate not on temporary, but on permanent causes of expense. If this principle be a just one, our attention would be directed to a provision in the favor of the state governments for an annual sum of about £200,000, while the exigencies of the Union could be susceptible of no limits. Even in imagination, this view of the subject, by what logic can be maintained, the local governments ought to be commanded in an exclusive source of revenue for any sum beyond the extent of £200,000. To extend its power further, in exclusion of the authority of the Union, would be able to take the resources of the community out of those hands which stood the need of them in the public welfare, in order to put them in other hands which could have no just or proper occasion to them. Suppose, then, a convention has been inclined to proceed upon the principles of repartition of the objects of revenue between the Union and its members in proportion to their comparative necessities. What particular fund could have been selected for the use of the states, that they would neither have been too much or too little for their present, too much for their futures, as far as the line of separation between external and internal taxes? This would leave the states at a rough compunction the command of 2/3 of the resources of the community to defray a 10th to a 12th part of its expenses, and to the Union 1/3 of the resources of the community to defray upon 9 to the 19/20ths of its expenses. If we desert this boundary and content ourselves with leaving the states an exclusive power of taxating houses and land, there would still be a great disproportion between the means and the end. The possession of 1/3 of resources of the community to supply at most 1/10 of its wants. If any fund could have been selected and appropriated equal to and not greater than the object, it would have been inadequate to discharge of the existing debts of the particular states. It would have been left to them dependent on the Union for a provision of this purpose. The preceding train of observation will justify the position which would have been elsewhere laid down. A concurrent jurisdiction in the article of taxation was the only admissible substitute for an entire subordination. And in respect to this branch of power, the state authority to that of the Union, any separate of the objects of revenues that could have been fallen upon, would have amounted to a sacrifice of the greatest interest of the Union to the power of the individual states. The convention ought to be concurrent jurisdiction preferable to the subordination in the event that has the least merit in reconciling an indefinite constitution power of taxation in the federal government, with an adequate and independent power to the states to provide for their own necessities. There remain a few other lights in which the important subject of taxation will claim further consideration. All right, Publius got through 34. Got through 4 of them tonight. That's a good 5% chunk. This raid will be done at the end of the year, but I'm going to try to do some more days. Hope everybody has a good night.